G'day, folks. Good to be here. Thanks for joining the session. So Val and Phoneboy asked me to have a conversation with you around ways that we could reduce the cost of a data breach. Now, much of what I'll be sharing with you are recommendations that that we've been making for a long time. But it's really good to see that that we now have external independent studies that are also validating our recommendations. So for this talk, I'm going to share with you strategies on how to reduce the cost of a data breach. And for that, I will reference a number of external studies. One of the studies that I'm going to share with you is the recent 2020 Ponemon Institute's cost of data breach report. Now, for this report, I'm hoping that you've actually had a chance to read this, but if you haven't, so for this report, the Ponemon Institute actually interviewed more than 3,200 individuals from 524 organizations that had suffered a data breach between August 2019 and April 2020. So we will cover some of the key findings from that. Now, one of the really nice things about this report is that they actually provided us with a number of vectors that threat actors had exploited in those breaches. So, so I think we need to talk about this because we want to be able to learn from these and make sure that you don't suffer the same fate. This report also focused on just let me share my slide as well. Just give me a second. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you can see my slides. Okay, so this report also, apart from the study, it also provided us with fantastic insights into factors that impacted the cost of the breach. So again, I'll share that with you. Now, apart from the Ponemon Institute's cost of data breach report, I will also be referencing various case studies from our incident response team. What you may not know is that Checkpoint has an incident response team who last year alone responded to more than 3,500 calls from organizations globally who were either under an attack or had just been breached. So I'll share some insights from them because they see what is working and what is not. Okay, so let me go next slide. Now, to calculate the cost of the data breach, the Ponemon Institute used an accounting method called activity-based costing. And as you can see, there are 4 main cost centers for each of these areas, and under each of these cost centers there are various different factors that was considered. Now, according to this report, the global average for a data breach is at the moment costs around $3.86 million, which was actually a little less than the previous year. But don't let that fool you. What the report also highlighted is the fact that there's a growing divide in the breach cost between organizations with more advanced security controls and processes and those with less advanced security controls and posture. Now, I'll cover exactly what those security processes and controls are a little later. So now that we have some background, let's first take a look at where we are today. What is the current state of play? And what I want to start by sharing with you is the actual average global cost of the actual average time it takes for an organization to identify and contain a breach. It's actually 280 days. Now, I've delivered this talk a number of times, and the concern I have is that these statistics no longer shocks many security professionals. And you see, that's the problem right there. It's a problem because our industry is not conditioned to accept this as normal. C-suites and executives are looking at this time frame as a reference point, which means that we've actually moved the needle so far that many of the strategies aren't actually focused on enough on preventing attacks, but rather focusing only on containment. What this now means for us is that on average, threat actors are creeping around our victims' environments for 207 days, moving laterally. This is on average, of course, moving laterally, going through various parts of the network, trying to understand their victim, to understand how they can monetize their victim as much as possible before their activities are identified. Now, you don't need to be Einstein to work out that the longer a threat is in your environment, the more damage it's going to cause. So we need to do a better job at drastically reducing the number of days it takes to identify and contain a breach. And another reason that we need to reduce this time frame is because, well, time is money. In this study, researchers have worked out the average cost of a data breach based on its life cycle or breach life cycle. And you can see here that the longer it takes for you to identify and contain a breach, the more it will cost your organization. In 2020, for example, you can see that the breach with a life cycle of more than 200 days, which is the time it takes to identify and contain a breach, is on average costing US $1.12 million more than if a breach was identified and contained in less than 200 days. So this is another reason why you need to implement tools and processes that will help reduce the breach life cycle. And when we look at the percentage change in average total cost of a breach from previous years, it's not good news for many organizations, because the cost of data breach is actually increasing, not a trend that we want to be maintaining. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. There are some good news here. And if I can just draw your attention to the bottom left here of the graph, you can see that organizations in countries like South Africa, France, Italy, and Germany have all managed to reverse this trend and actually reduce the cost of a data breach from previous year. So it is possible. Now, the big question is, what are they doing that the rest of the world isn't? And the answer is that they're doing a lot better at addressing some of the big ticket items that I'll be sharing with you just a little later. Now, I can appreciate that many of the audience today are from various different backgrounds and various different industries. So you can take a look here and see how your specific industry is doing compared to the other industries. So I'll leave that there for a few more seconds. Okay, now before I dive into the top attack vectors successfully exploited in the study that the Ponemon Institute carried out, I wanted to share with you cyber attack trends based on our own telemetry data for the US and EMEA organizations. In May 2021, US organizations saw an average of 671 weekly attacks, which is an increase of 70% in cyber attacks year on year. So that's a 70% increase from this time last year. And in EMEA, the weekly average cyber attacks per organization was 780 in May this year, which is a 21% increase since the beginning of the year, but a whopping 97% increase year on year. So 97% increase from this time last year for organizations in EMEA. That's a massive increase. And another interesting fact is that in EMEA attacks on IoT devices have gone up by 144%, and mobile attacks are up 41%. Now, it's unbelievable how many organizations that I speak to still don't take mobile security seriously. So really important that you do. Okay, so as I said, the Ponemon Institute had provided us with the key attack vectors that was used in all of those breaches. So I'm going to share that with you now. And these are basically the big ticket items that I want you to pay urgent attention to. These are where most organizations are still failing to implement effective security controls. Now, I want to be very clear that most organizations will have some sort of security controls to address these vectors. But the problem is that the tools being used are not very effective. So the real question I want you to be asking yourself is, how effective are my security controls and my security policies for these big ticket items? So the number one attack vector for the data breaches, according to Ponemon Institute, is compromised credential. 19% of organizations that suffered a data breach failed to simply prevent corporate credentials from falling into the wrong hands. Another 19% of the breaches, that's nearly 1 in every 5 data breach, was due to cloud misconfiguration. Almost every company now has a cloud strategy. Our incident response team has also seen a huge increase in the number of cloud-based attacks. 16% of breaches were due to vulnerability in third-party software. So you must have a robust vulnerability management game plan. Having a well-segmented network is also essential in preventing threat actors from moving laterally in your environment once they've exploited a vulnerability. This is why the whole concept of zero trust is so important. Next, I've actually grouped phishing attacks and business email compromise together, because typically a business email compromise starts with a phishing attack anyway. And as you can see here, these two attack vectors make up 19% of breaches. So these 5 attack vectors was successfully utilized by threat actors for nearly 3/4 of the breaches that the Ponemon Institute studied. So you've got to ruthlessly prioritize your security controls for these top 5 attack vectors and re-evaluate the effectiveness of your security control. Really important that you do this. The Checkpoint Incident Response team have worked many cases where businesses had controls but were ineffective. So as part of your cybersecurity risk assessment, I urge you to identify the effectiveness of these security controls. I know it's a lot of work. I know it's going to be a lot of heartache, but it will be worth it. So make sure you understand where you are vulnerable and deal with it. Please make sure you also assess the risk for all of these other attack vectors and the risk that it poses to your organization, and make sure you have a strategy to address these as well. Now that we know where these attack vectors are, where do you start? I think it's really important that you start with the right mindset. And the right mindset when it comes to cybersecurity is a prevention mindset. The more threats your security controls prevent, the less your team has to run around and remediate. Right? The more threats you prevent, the less likely you're going to be the low-hanging fruit for cyber criminals. So what's the difference between prevention and detection? This is what prevention and detection look like. Our incident response team have worked many cases where post-breach analysis has revealed that threats could have been prevented. Most of the so-called sophisticated attacks that we hear about on the news from organizations are not that sophisticated. Now, I want you to understand that most of these breaches could have been prevented. So you have to change your mindset. Now, I'm not saying that you will be successful in preventing 100% of these attacks. And that's why your defense strategy must also be paired with automatic remediation. If you have manual processes, you must automate as much as possible. Another reason why you must change this mindset is because we're seeing evolution of threats like ransomware attacks. And this is could have devastating attacks on the sick and the vulnerable in our community. So I'm sure you've all heard about double extortion. This is a ransomware trend where threat actors simply, well, not simply, but they basically compromise an environment, they steal the data, then they hold you ransom for the data, and then they also ask for ransom for the systems that they've encrypted. Folks, I have some bad news. We now have seen an evolution of this trend, which we've dubbed triple extortion. in triple extortion. And the first case of this was actually witnessed in Finland, where a psychotherapy clinic suffered a data breach, resulting in approximately 40,000 patient files being stolen. This was in October last year. What was really interesting about this is that, of course, the threat actors asked for a ransom for the database. They asked for a ransom for the encrypted systems, but then they started going through the database and looking through each of those patients, and they started to reach out and send emails to those patients and threatened them and asked for a ransom from those patients, right? And they asked for a small amount of ransom from each of these patients. Now, the sad thing is that one of the victim, or one of the very first victim, was actually an elderly gentleman who had just been diagnosed with a terminal illness and was told that he had about a year to live. This guy was going through a mental breakdown. He was, he had his demons, and he'd just gotten, he'd just come to terms with the idea that that his life was going to be over soon. And while he's dealing with all of this trauma, some low-life criminal was trying to extort him for a ransom and threatening him that they wouldn't release his therapy notes to his family and the public. So we're seeing that now. And the concern here is that in that same database, there were also a lot of vulnerable children, their information as well. So you see, it's this is where basically the threat, the trend is now, right? So it's not just about the resilience of businesses, but also the safety of our community that is at stake here. The board and the C-suite and security professionals, including CISOs, must understand that if they are the custodians of sensitive data, they have a responsibility to those individuals who put their trust in these organizations. Now, let's address the top 5 attack vectors for majority of the breaches that was investigated by the Ponemon Institute. So the first attack root cause for attack or for breaches was compromised credentials. One of the security controls that you can use to mitigate the threats from compromised credential is obviously to use multi-factor authentication where possible. Now, this should be part of your foundational security controls and a non-negotiable. However, the reality is that most organizations will still use static corporate credentials in some capacity. So make sure your security controls prevent or alert you when your end users expose their corporate credentials to sites that don't belong to your organization. Now, to address corporate credentials, it's essential to also focus not only on laptops and tablets, but also on mobile phones, because phishing emails can be delivered via messaging apps and like WhatsApp as well as SMS, right? So the question you need to ask is, do I have a way for all my users to scan links that they receive on their mobile phones? Do you have a way to block access to newly registered domains that are impersonating your corporate domain? If your organization has a multi-factor authentication strategy that relies on mobile devices that are receiving SMS tokens, it is important that you secure the mobile device itself. Otherwise, it has the potential of becoming the weak link in your cyber strategy. If you do these 3 things, it will help you reduce the risk from 3 of the top 5 attack vectors that are currently being exploited. So make sure you implement effective security controls to block phishing emails. Look for browser-based protection as well, because your end users are also likely to get phished via their personal email. Now, still on the topic of phishing attacks, by far, majority of the attacks are delivered via emails with a weaponized document, such as Office documents and PDFs. So one of the most effective way to address threats embedded in these types of weaponized emails is to use content disarm and reconstruction. Basically, you are sanitizing the document by removing anything that could be used for malicious purpose. This technology, when you combine it with sandboxing, provides a very powerful threat prevention strategy. Here's a quick demo. So in this example, we're taking a Word document and then reconstructing it. And we're reconstructing it with only known good parameters by removing any active content that could potentially be malicious. Very simple, very easy. It's nothing new. We've had this technology for many, many years now, but it is one of those really, really cool, solid technology that helps you address threats against patient zero. Okay, so the other prominent attack that the Ponemon Institute highlighted, of course, was cloud misconfiguration. In the last 5 years of working cloud incidents, we've seen a huge increase in cloud-based attacks, right? And it's very clear to us that that most organizations simply don't understand the shared responsibility model, especially when they go from infrastructure as a service to the software as a service to all the containers and serverless stuff. Yeah, sure, we have faster ways of doing things, but it's really important that you understand that security is still your responsibility. We see many organizations that make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And they all center around account takeover, vulnerabilities, and misconfiguration. 9 out of 10 calls that we receive in our incident response team for cloud breaches end up being something as stupid as a Bitcoin miner. Attackers are doing the same thing they've done for the last 20 or 30 years of the internet, which is to look for vulnerable services and exploit them for their own gain. In a recent case that we worked, we received a call from an organization that wanted to understand how their CFO was duped into transferring a large sum of money. And now this sounded like a straight up business email compromise, right? So we started our investigation by taking a look at the Office 365 configuration, because typically this is where these types of attacks play out. And what we noticed was that the customer actually, or the victim in this case, actually had really good security. They had multi-factor authentication, they had external email filters, they had all the right security controls, they were looking and monitoring their logs. They actually didn't do anything poorly. And we couldn't actually find any employee that had been compromised. Now, we wanted to understand, obviously, what had happened here. We wanted to understand and identify the attackers' tactics, techniques, and procedures, the modus operandi, right? How they do things, because if you do that, then you can fingerprint the whole attack. Now, so to do that, we started digging deeper because we wanted to understand what had happened. And as we were digging deeper, we noticed that the communication between the CFO and one of the suppliers had subtly changed over time. Someone was manipulating these conversations. Again, this just sounded like a straight up business email compromise. But when we dug, what we found was something really interesting. The actual attack vector was the partner account. You see, SaaS applications like Office 365, WebEx, these kind of SaaS applications have a component that allows for partners to be able to manage their customers' environment and their client's environment. And in this case, a threat actor was able to send an email and convince one of the junior administrator of the partner environment, a partner account, to share their multi-factor authentication. Now, why would you do that? I know as a security professional, you should never share that, but this guy was duped into sharing his credentials. And so that was the initial entry point. And the interesting thing was, as we were doing our investigation, we actually found new mailboxes popping up. Someone was actually creating mailboxes while we were doing our investigation. And someone was creating these mailboxes to pretend to be someone that they're not, to imitate someone that they're not. And it wasn't just mailboxes that were popping up. We actually found new Azure infrastructure that was being stood up as well, probably for additional attacks against this victim, or maybe additional attacks against other victims. So this is a new type of attack that we're seeing, where partners are being attacked, being the attack vector. So really important that you understand this, and you understand that you have to also make sure that if you are getting your partners to provide you with services around your SaaS applications, you've got to monitor what the level of access you're giving them. Do you want them to be able to make changes to your Office 365 or other SaaS platforms? Do you want them able to stand up new accounts? It's really important that you're constantly monitoring these things. Now, we worked another case where an organization wanted us to come and assist them and understand how they suffered a complete data breach. And in this case, it was unfortunately a case where a administrator had made a simple mistake in AWS. You see, an administrator had accidentally exposed an admin panel to the public, and so an attacker was able to access that admin panel. They were able to get root on the server, and then they started mapping out the customer's environment. And what they would have noticed fairly quickly is that there was a VPN connection back to corporate. And on the other end of the VPN was a database server. The attacker was able to use the same credentials to access the database server and then extorted a large ransom from the customer, or the victim in this case. Now, we see these types of attacks all the time. And the problem is that most organizations simply do not appreciate how dynamic cloud environments are. They don't understand how much change is going on in the cloud environment. So the rate at which these changes are being done, you've got to have the right tools that provide you with visibility and the ability to automatically make changes to correct the misconfigurations. And so the key to cloud security is visibility and control. Make sure you have a way to visualize all of your cloud assets and a way to automatically remediate misconfiguration. If you have cloud adoption strategy, then cloud posture management tool must be a non-negotiable in your cyber strategy. Now, vulnerabilities in third-party software was another big ticket item. It's not just the zero-day stuff that you need to be worried about. As you can see here, this is basically last year's telemetry data that we have, right? So as you can see, attackers just last year alone are still using vulnerabilities from over a decade ago. So it's not just the zero-day stuff that you need to be worried about, right? And we get it, right? Patching systems takes time, but cyber criminals aren't going to wait for you to patch your system. So you have to focus on preventing attacks before they reach vulnerable systems. This is why virtual patching must be part of your vulnerability patch management strategy. Make sure your IPS are configured in line with vendor best practice. Make sure that you are automating the downloading of IPS signatures. Make sure you have a well-segmented network with advanced security controls, such as IPS in the core of your network as well as on the perimeter. Don't be the low-hanging fruit. Use virtual patching to prevent as much of the attacks as possible. Okay, now let's take a look at the key factors that impact the cost of a data breach. I cannot stress how important it is for your cyber resilience strategy to take all of these into account. So what you're seeing here in the green are the various factors that will reduce the cost of a data breach. And the reds are obviously factors that will increase the cost of data breach. So according to the Ponemon Institute, according to their 2020 cost of data breach report, testing and fine-tuning your incident response plan has the biggest impact in reducing the cost of a data breach. Implementing an effective business continuity plan has the second highest impact in reducing the cost of a data breach. Just actually having an incident response team will reduce the cost, help you reduce the cost of data breach. Now, rounding up the top four is using AI-based platforms. What they're really referring to here are platforms that can automate and orchestrate your incident response and take the burden off your SOC team. So if you are not doing this already, I recommend that you invest time and understand the benefit that automating your incident response can deliver to you. Investing in red team testing, security awareness training, security analytic encryption technology, and threat intelligence all obviously shield great results in reducing the cost of a data breach. So make sure you look at all of these factors that actually reduce the cost of your data breach. Now let's take a look at factors that increase the cost of data breach. So the worst thing that you could do with your cyber strategy is to keep throwing point products into the mix, because this leads to security complexity. Getting your cloud strategy wrong adds a lot to your cost of a data breach. And again, this is why you must have a way to visualize your cloud assets so that you can see what is happening in your cloud. And you have to have a tool that can automatically remediate any of the misconfigurations and security oversights. Skill shortage is another factor that is costing organizations dearly. So if they get breached. So it's important that you have a strategy to address this. All of these factors are important, and your cyber resilience strategy must take them into account. Let's take a deep dive in some of these larger impact factors. So as you saw earlier, the most important factor in reducing the cost of a data breach was obviously incident response plan testing. Now, many of the organizations that called us for help had an incident response plan, but when it was put to test, they failed miserably. So make sure to get your incident response playbook validated by an external incident response team who do this for a living. Now, this is a service that we offer here at Checkpoint, right? Our incident response team provides incident response for not just internally, but also for many of our customers. They've seen more incident response plans fail than you can possibly imagine. So they can help you fine-tune your incident response plan before it's too late. Please use that to your advantage. You have to do tabletop exercise under new normal condition. One of the key learnings from our incident response team is that most organizations don't actually have a platform to enable efficient cross-company communication and collaboration between key stakeholders. The legal team, your PR team, your HR team, your executives, and your incident response SOC teams don't actually have a way to effectively communicate with each other during crisis. If your email systems and your Active Directory are hit with ransomware, how will your incident response teams collaborate and communicate? Now, we've heard of organizations that have had to actually revert to WhatsApp group because they had no other choice. So ask yourself, do we have a platform for crisis management? And a platform for crisis management that will allow us, all of our stakeholders, in fact, to be able to effectively communicate. And if you don't, then it's time for you to invest in one. One of the topics on the topic of tabletop exercise, this is a sample report that organizations get when they do a tabletop exercise with us. Right, so as you can see here, we run both technical sessions and leadership sessions, and the report identify opportunities for improvement. The recommendations can be both specific around incident response playbooks or training for staff in specific SOC and incident response areas as well. We also review communication processes as well as technical controls. So if you are serious about the maturity level of your cybersecurity program, then a tabletop exercise is an absolute must. Okay, the next big ticket item after incident response in reducing the cost of data breach was business continuity. As the saying goes, failing to prepare is preparing to fail. Now, I think COVID-19 has highlighted just how many organizations had poor business continuity plan. Not testing business continuity plan has resulted in a just do it mindset, where it was a case of let's just do this and we'll ask for forgiveness later. Now, unfortunately, what I've seen is that many projects, especially remote working projects and cloud projects, have been rushed through without proper assurance process. This has led to many security oversights which are being actively exploited. So please test and fine tune your business continuity plan. Make sure your security is embedded in your continuity plan. Be sure to identify all types of threats that could impact your organization, and have a game plan on what systems and resources need to be restored first. By the way, here is just one example or one proof that security oversights are as a result of this pandemic. So you can see here how last year, as the world started to go into lockdown, threat actors began exploiting exposed RDP servers. So don't do that. Put it behind a VPN. Now, in my mind, the most critical team when it comes to reducing the cost of data breach for any organization is the SOC team. They are the glue that hold your incident response together. But when we talk to these teams, they are absolutely flat out and are often drowning in the number of alerts and mundane tasks. The recent Tale of Two SOC report that you're seeing now, again from the Polman Institute, highlights just how bad the situation is. 78% of SOC analysts claim working in SOC teams as very painful. 3 out of 4 SOC engineers are experiencing burnout as a result of increased workload. And when you take into consideration that year on year, we are seeing a massive rise in cyber attacks, the number of attacks, as I showed you earlier, the future is not looking very good. This trend of analysts suffering from burnouts is only going to increase. As you can see here, the last line of defense are screaming out for help. Information overload is a huge problem, which will continue to be a bigger problem as businesses deploy new security controls, which will generate, of course, more logs. Now, the report also confirms that what we learned in the cost of data breach report, which is that complexity is a major issue for SOC teams to deal with. Now, every single one of these trends is going in the wrong direction. If you want to reduce the cost of a breach, you have to have a strategy for all of these different challenges you can see here. Now, when we speak to SOC teams, they feel all alone in their mission to save their team from defeat, much like this next guy.
Yes, he does. Here he goes, winding up for the shot, and oh! The cannon has fired and hit Sterling directly to the face. Here he goes with the approach. Oh! Sterling with a fantastic dive. Yes, as his trainer takes him off the field like a mustached lion dragging a gazelle through the Serengeti. Still waiting for the kick to happen. He's probably wondering when. Oh! Sweet butter crumpets! The ball drills Sterling right in the face. He literally just has to kick it anywhere except where Sterling is sitting. There is no possible way that North Carolina can mess up this shot. Oh! 158 kilometers per hour! This man can do no wrong! Look at him beg for mercy!
Okay, all jokes aside, the Tale of Two SOCs report provides some great insights on what makes SOC teams ineffective. And so, as you can see, the survey validates that what I've said before, lack of visibility is a huge problem for SOC teams. This report confirms to us that SOC team, and one of the reasons for this is because they have a lot of mundane tasks that chew up a lot of valuable time, but tasks that are repetitive. Right, these guys have to do these tasks again and again. And so when you speak to SOC teams, any SOC manager, they will tell you just how understaffed they are as well. And the reason is that it's next to impossible to find good SOC analysts. And as you can see here, another reason why SOC teams struggle tools. If you look at a sales organizations, they will typically have 1 or 2, something like Salesforce or Workday. But for SOC teams, they have to manually check multiple different tools and validate results against various different systems. All of these things take time increase the time that it takes to identify and contain breaches. The problem is that having all of these security tools is that the problem with this is that there's no connectivity fabric between them, so that these tools, from different vendors, don't behave in the way that a suite of products do. So if you want a high-performing SOC team, you must find a way to address these challenges. And one of the ways you can do that, in my opinion, is to implement a SOAR platform, or a security orchestration platform, to automate all of these mundane tasks. Now, my recommendation here is to look for a vendor agnostic SOAR platform, so that that plays well with various security players, various major security players. Now, before I wrap up, the last thing I want to touch on is security complexity. The reality is that most organizations have many security tools from many vendors. As I showed you earlier, security complexity was the largest factor in increasing the cost of a data breach. So have a strategy to reduce the number of point products that you have and simplify your security architecture. At Checkpoint, we've been helping organizations secure their network, their cloud, endpoint, mobile, and now IoT as well. We can help secure users and their devices no matter where they are. Our incident response team can help you help you carry out security assessments. We can help you fine-tune your incident response playbooks and even build out your SOC capabilities. So I think it's important for you to lead your organization down a path where they can consolidate their security and reduce the number of point products. This is essential if you want to reduce the time it takes to identify and contain a data breach. So I think this is worth revisiting this slide. If your organization is serious about reducing cost of data breach, these are the key factors that your cyber resilience strategy absolutely must focus on. Okay, so in summary, to reduce the cost of data breach, these are the main areas you need to focus and do well. The top 3 or 4 in my mind are: first, validate and practice your incident response. This includes doing tabletop exercise under the new normal conditions. Secure your cloud environment with a cloud posture management tool. This is a very simple deployment and provides you with a huge amount of visibility and control. These first 2 points can be done fairly quickly. So think of them as quick wins for your cyber strategy. Take a look at the various SOAR platforms and evaluate how it can take the load off your SOC team and your incident response team. And finally, simplify your security. Seriously consider consolidating your vendors. So thank you so much. That's me done. That's me on the screen there, my LinkedIn details if you want to reach out. I think we can now move to question and answer. So I'll take a quick look at the Q&A section. If there's anything here, I will address them.
Surprisingly, we don't see any questions. There were some, but not really related specifically to your topic.
Okay.
Also, Ashwin, I believe your video froze somewhere 10 minutes before the end for a known reason, but
okay.
I can promise you looked really good on this frozen frame.
You're thinking.
Yeah, and yes, I can only repeat what Jason just wrote in the Q&A. It was an awesome presentation. I think it's very compelling and useful, and we'll be happy to share it, as Damon said before, on Checkmate's video and the slides alike